The night was settling in as I pulled into the driveway, the glow from the streetlights casting long shadows across our neatly manicured lawn. I killed the engine, sat in the car for a moment, and let out a heavy sigh. It had been another long day at the factory. As the general manager, the demands never seemed to end: production schedules, employee issues, budget concerns. It was a grind, but it was my grind, and I took pride in it. Providing for Chloe was my top priority, and I'd do whatever it took to keep her comfortable and happy. Pushing open the door, I grabbed the bags of groceries from the passenger seat. Chloe had texted earlier, asking if I could pick up a few things on my way home. She was always at the gym in the evenings, so it made sense for me to handle the errands. She loved that place, spent hours there every day, sculpting her body to perfection. And it showed. Chloe was stunning, with a physique that turned heads everywhere we went. I admired her dedication, even if I didn't quite understand it. For me, life was simpler: good food, a cold beer, and a job well done. The house was quiet as I stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint still lingering from the recent renovations. We had decided to give the place a bit of a facelift, trying to breathe new life into it, much like our marriage, I supposed. I set the bags down on the kitchen counter and started putting things away, my mind drifting as I worked. Our relationship had always been solid, or so I thought. We had a good life together. Sure, things weren't as fiery as they used to be, but that's normal after a few years of marriage, right? I figured it was just the natural progression of things. We had our routines, our roles. Chloe took care of herself, kept the house running smoothly, and I worked hard to keep us comfortable. It was a partnership, one that I believed in deeply. But lately, I'd noticed a change in Chloe. She seemed more distant, more preoccupied. She spent more time at the gym, coming home later and later each night. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying she was just pushing herself harder to reach her fitness goals. I didn't push the issue. I trusted her, and I figured she just needed some space. Maybe I was being paranoid, but there were moments, fleeting, unsettling moments, when I felt like I was losing her. The front door creaked open, and Chloe walked in, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, a light sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. She looked radiant, her body toned and tight, her skin glowing. She smiled at me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, babe," she said, dropping her bag by the door and heading to the fridge for a bottle of water. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "How was the gym?" "Good, tough workout today," she said, taking a long drink. "I'm really pushing myself." I nodded, watching her as she moved around the kitchen, grabbing a protein bar from the pantry. She seemed restless, like she was in a hurry to be somewhere else, even though she was finally home. "You've been spending a lot of time there lately," I said casually, leaning against the counter. "Everything okay?" She paused, her back to me, and for a moment I thought she might not answer. Then she turned around, a soft smile on her lips. "Yeah, everything's fine. I need this, you know? It's my way of staying sane." "I get it," I said, though I wasn't sure I really did. "Just don't overdo it, okay?" "Don't worry about me," she replied, her smile widening. "I'm tougher than I look." We ate dinner together, but the conversation was sparse, mostly about mundane things, the renovations, her gym routine, my day at work. The connection we once had, the ease with which we could talk about anything and everything, seemed to have faded. I told myself it was just a phase, that we were both busy and tired. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind told me there was more to it. After dinner, Chloe excused herself to take a shower, and I settled on the couch with a beer, flipping through channels without really paying attention. I tried to shake off the unease that had been building in me for weeks, but it clung to me like a shadow. I loved Chloe more than anything, and I couldn't imagine my life without her. But there was a distance between us now, one that I couldn't quite bridge. She was still here, still physically present, but emotionally, she was somewhere else. And I didn't know how to reach her. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside her, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. I wanted to ask her, to confront her about what was really going on, but I was afraid of the answer. Afraid that whatever was wrong between us was bigger than I could handle. So I stayed silent, staring up at the ceiling, hoping that this was just a rough patch and that we would find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew that things were changing. And I didn't know how to stop it. In the darkness of our bedroom, with Chloe asleep beside me, I felt more alone than I had in years. And I had no idea what to do about it. The days seemed to blend together lately. I'd wake up before the sun, head to the factory, and spend my hours managing the relentless grind of production. It was hard work, but I liked it that way. When I came home, Chloe was either just coming back from the gym or had already showered and settled into her routine. Our evenings were predictable: dinner, a bit of small talk, maybe a movie if we weren't too tired, and then bed. Everything seemed normal enough, but there was something gnawing at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Chloe had always been the disciplined one, and I admired that about her. She was the type who'd set her mind to something and see it through, no matter what. I remember when she first got serious about her fitness, how proud I was of her commitment. I'd joke about how she could probably bench press me if she tried, and she'd laugh and say, maybe one day. But lately, I noticed things that didn't sit right with me. She started spending more time at the gym than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was pushing herself harder, or maybe the gym had become a way for her to unwind after a long day. But it wasn't just the extra hours, it was the way she'd come home, looking almost distant. It was subtle, but there was a shift in how she acted around me, like she was always somewhere else, even when she was sitting right next to me. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to surprise her by picking her up from the gym. I figured we could grab breakfast together, maybe talk about something other than our usual routine. I parked a few spaces down from her car, feeling a little foolish for sitting there, waiting like some teenager on a first date. As the minutes passed, I started to second-guess myself. Maybe this was a bad idea. But then, I saw her. Chloe was talking to a guy near the entrance, a tall, muscular guy I didn't recognize. They were standing close, laughing about something, and the way he looked at her, it made my stomach twist. I knew that look. I used to give her that look. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just a friendly conversation between two gym regulars. But something about it didn't feel right. After a while, she walked to her car, her smile lingering as she got in and drove off. I stayed parked, watching her taillights disappear, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to make of what I'd just seen. That night, over dinner, I couldn't shake the image of Chloe with that guy. I tried to bring it up casually, asking her how the gym was and if she was making any new friends. She paused for a second, just a beat too long, and then smiled, telling me about some new routines she was trying. She mentioned the guy, Marcus, she called him, said he was helping her with her workouts, giving her tips. I wanted to ask more, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, like she was daring me to question her. Or maybe it was my own fear of what I might find out. So I let it go, nodded, and pretended like everything was fine. But inside, I couldn't stop the doubts from creeping in. As the days went by, I started noticing more signs, little things that added up to something bigger. The way she'd check her phone more often, smiling at messages she didn't share with me. The way she'd be in a rush to leave the house, always with some vague excuse about needing extra time at the gym. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired from work and imagining things. But that small voice in the back of my head kept whispering that something was off. One night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence between us was suffocating, and I had to say something. Chloe, I began, my voice barely above a whisper, is everything okay? With us, I mean? She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might open up, tell me what was going on. But then she just smiled, a sad, tired smile. "Joe, everything's fine," she said, reaching out to touch my hand. "I'm just tired. The workouts, the house, it's a lot, you know?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. I didn't push her, though. I didn't want to start a fight or make things worse. So I just nodded, squeezed her hand, and let it go. But the doubts didn't go away. If anything, they only grew stronger. I couldn't keep living like this, with all these questions and no answers. I needed to know what was really going on, why Chloe was pulling away from me. And I knew that if I wanted the truth, I was going to have to find it myself. I wasn't sure where to start or what I'd uncover, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I'd find out what was really going on, no matter how much it hurt. Because the not knowing, the uncertainty, that was killing me more than anything else. The factory was unusually quiet that evening, with most of the workers having clocked out hours ago. I stayed behind, hoping the solitude would help me focus on a project I'd been working on for months. It was more than just a project to me, it was my ticket out of the endless grind. I had this idea, one that could be a game changer, something that could turn our lives around. I'd been chipping away at it in my spare time, late at night when Chloe was asleep or while she was at the gym. The factory work paid the bills, but this was my dream. I stayed later than usual, finally leaving the office when my eyes began to blur from staring at the screen. As I drove home, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. Tonight, I decided, I'd organize everything. I had folders scattered all over my laptop, files named hastily, lost in the mess of daily life. If I wanted to make this startup happen, I needed to get serious about it. When I got home, the house was dark, except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Chloe wasn't home yet, and I felt a pang of irritation. She'd been staying out later and later, always with some excuse about a new workout class or needing extra time to herself. I wasn't sure if I believed her anymore. But tonight wasn't about Chloe, it was about getting my life in order. I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, headed into my home office, and powered up my laptop. The screen flickered to life, and I began sifting through the chaos. There were documents everywhere, spreadsheets, notes, mock-ups, all mixed in with our personal files, photos, and videos. I couldn't remember where I had saved my most recent work, so I started going through each folder, one by one. After about an hour, my frustration was mounting. I couldn't find the damn file anywhere. I clicked through another folder, one I didn't recognize. It was labeled simply with Chloe's name. Curious, and maybe a little annoyed that she had files cluttering up my laptop, I opened it. There were dozens of files inside, mostly photos and videos. I almost closed it, thinking it was just her fitness progress pictures or some nonsense, but something made me stop. My eyes landed on a video file with a date that was recent, too recent. My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on it. The video began to play, and for a moment, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The screen was dark at first, then the camera adjusted, revealing a dimly lit room. And then I saw her, Chloe, unmistakably Chloe, wearing nothing but a black lace bra and panties. She was smiling, a seductive smile I hadn't seen in years, and then other people came into view. My blood ran cold as the scene unfolded before me. It wasn't just one man, it was several, all of them surrounding her, touching her, undressing her. The camera angle shifted, and I saw their faces, strangers, men I had never seen before. And they were all. I couldn't even bring myself to think it. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Chloe, my wife, was in the center of it all, her body moving with theirs, the sounds of their grunts and her moans filling the room. It was like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me, leaving me gasping for air. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen. It could have been minutes, or maybe hours. The world around me faded away, and all that existed was the horror playing out before me. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I wanted to scream, to smash the laptop, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but watch. Finally, the video ended, and the screen went black. I was left in the silence of my office, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stared at the blank screen, my mind a chaotic mess of disbelief, rage, and pain. How could she do this? How could she betray me like this? My first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers, but something stopped me. The anger was there, boiling just beneath the surface, but it was mixed with confusion and a deep, gnawing hurt. I needed to think, to figure out what the hell was going on. I couldn't just storm into our bedroom and start shouting accusations. I needed to know more, to understand how this had happened. For the next 15 minutes, I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. My mind replayed the video over and over, each time driving the knife deeper into my gut. I had so many questions, but no answers, only the sickening images that were now burned into my brain. Eventually, I forced myself to close the laptop. My hands were still trembling as I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, the darkness pressing in around me. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I needed air. I needed to get out of there before I lost it completely. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked to the kitchen. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay in that office, couldn't sit there with those images in my head. I needed to clear my mind, to think. But all I could think about was Chloe, my wife, the woman I had trusted with everything, being with those men, letting them. The anger surged again, white-hot and blinding. I slammed my fist down on the counter, the pain sharp and immediate. It didn't help. Nothing would help. The only thing I wanted was to wake up from this nightmare, to find out that it wasn't real. But it was real. And now, I had to decide what to do about it. When I finally made my way to bed, Chloe was already asleep. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, my emotions churning. She looked peaceful, innocent, like nothing was wrong. But I knew better now. I knew the truth, or at least part of it. As I lay down beside her, I felt a coldness between us, a distance that hadn't been there before. I didn't touch her, didn't say a word. I just stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to know everything, every detail, every reason. I needed to hear it from her own lips. But not yet. I wasn't ready to confront her, not until I had all the pieces. So I decided to wait, to gather more information, to make sure that when I did confront her, I'd be ready. But the anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally explode. And when it did, I knew there would be no going back. The next day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Every hour felt like an eternity as I went through the motions at the factory. My mind was anywhere but on work, it was stuck on that video, replaying it in my head on an endless loop. I tried to focus, to keep my emotions in check, but it was impossible. The rage and betrayal were like a poison, seeping into every corner of my thoughts. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until I could go home and face Chloe. But when the end of the day finally came, I wasn't ready. The truth was, I didn't know if I'd ever be ready. How do you confront the person you love more than anything in the world after finding out they betrayed you in the worst possible way? On the drive home, I wrestled with what to say. Do I explode, let the anger out and demand answers? Or do I play it cool, try to get her to confess without tipping my hand? Neither option felt right. My heart wanted to scream, but my mind told me to be cautious. There was too much at stake. When I walked through the door, Chloe was in the kitchen, just like always, preparing dinner. She turned and smiled at me, and for a brief moment, I almost believed everything was normal. But the smile didn't reach her eyes, and I could see the cracks in the facade she was trying so hard to maintain. The image from the night before flashed through my mind, and I had to clench my fists to stop myself from shaking. "Hey, how was work?" she asked, her voice light, almost too casual. "Same as usual," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. I moved to the fridge and grabbed a beer, hoping it would calm my nerves. "How was your day?" "Good." I hit the gym again, tried out a new routine Marcus suggested. "I'm really feeling it today." She smiled again, but this time I noticed something different. Was it guilt? Regret? I couldn't be sure. Marcus seems to be helping you a lot lately, I said, testing the waters. I watched her closely, looking for any sign that she might crack. He's just giving me some tips, Joe. He knows a lot about fitness, and I want to make sure I'm doing everything right. She spoke quickly, too quickly, and I could see a flicker of something in her eyes, panic, maybe. I took a swig of my beer, letting the silence hang between us. That's good, I finally said, forcing myself to sound casual. I'm glad you've got someone to push you. She nodded, turning back to the stove, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was hiding something, and we both knew it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We ate dinner, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept looking at her, trying to see the woman I thought I knew, but all I could see was the betrayal. The more I watched her, the more convinced I became that she was hiding more than just the affair. There was something else, something deeper that she wasn't telling me. After dinner, I excused myself and went to my office, telling her I had some work to catch up on. In reality, I couldn't stand to be around her any longer. I needed space to think, to plan my next move. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen. The file was still there, taunting me, reminding me of everything I had seen. I clicked on it again, my heart pounding in my chest as the video started to play. This time, I forced myself to watch it all the way through, to absorb every detail. It was torture, but I needed to understand. I needed to know how deep the betrayal went. The video was longer than I remembered, and as it played out, I felt the anger inside me grow, until it was a burning rage that I could barely contain. When it finally ended, I sat back, drained and defeated. There was no denying it, Chloe had been unfaithful, and not just once. This was something planned, something she had chosen to do, knowing full well what it would do to me if I found out. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological. She had made a decision that shattered everything we had built together. But why? That was the question that kept gnawing at me. Why would she do this? What could possibly drive her to betray me like this? I needed answers, and I knew the only way to get them was to confront her. But I couldn't do it in the heat of the moment, not while my emotions were still raw. I had to be smart about this, careful. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her just yet. I needed more information, more leverage. If I went in blind, she could deny everything, spin some story that would leave me even more confused. No, I needed to be sure, to have all the facts before I made my move. Over the next few days, I started watching her more closely. I paid attention to every little detail, her behavior, her phone calls, the way she talked about the gym and Marcus. I began to notice patterns, small inconsistencies that confirmed my suspicions. She was hiding something, and it wasn't just the affair. One evening, after another late-night gym session, she came home and went straight to the shower. I waited until I heard the water running, then grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. My hands shook as I unlocked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I had to know. I scrolled through her messages, my breath catching in my throat when I saw Marcus's name. There were dozens of messages, some innocent, others, not so much. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a casual flirtation. They had been planning this for weeks, months even. The videos were just the tip of the iceberg. But it wasn't just the messages that bothered me. It was the way she talked to him, the way she seemed so open, so honest with him, things she hadn't been with me in a long time. It was like she was living two lives, one with me and one with him, and I was the outsider. When I finally put the phone down, I felt sick to my stomach. The reality of the situation was worse than I had imagined. This wasn't just a one-time mistake, this was a calculated betrayal, something she had done willingly, knowing full well the consequences. I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. I wasn't ready. Instead, I went to bed, lying there in the dark, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Chloe slept beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I wanted to shake her awake, to scream at her, demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't solve anything. I needed to be calm, rational. I needed to plan my next move carefully. The next morning, I left for work early, before she even woke up. I couldn't stand to look at her, to pretend that everything was okay when it was far from it. At the factory, I buried myself in work, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. But I knew I couldn't run from this forever. Sooner or later, I would have to confront her. And when I did, there would be no more lies, no more secrets. I would get the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The tension in our house had been building for days. Every glance, every word, every silence between Chloe and me felt charged with something we both knew was coming. The routine we once had, the comfortable rhythm of our lives, was gone, replaced by a sense of impending doom that hung over everything. It was suffocating, but I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. Tonight had to be the night. When I walked in that evening, I could hear the sounds of dinner being prepared, pans clattering, water boiling, the sizzle of something on the stove. It was almost too normal, too much like every other night before everything fell apart. The smell of cooking filled the house, but instead of making me hungry, it turned my stomach. I found Chloe in the kitchen, her back to me as she stood over the stove, stirring a pot of sauce. She didn't turn around when I entered, but she must have sensed something, because her movements slowed, and the usual hum she had while cooking was conspicuously absent. I watched her for a moment, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the one I had seen in that video. It was impossible. They were two different people in my mind now. "Chloe," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, strained and harsh. She turned to look at me, a smile starting to form on her lips, but it faded quickly when she saw my expression. "What's wrong, Joe?" she asked, her voice tinged with that familiar softness she always used when she was concerned about me. But now, it felt like a lie, like everything else. "We need to talk," I replied, my tone flat, almost dead. I wasn't going to drag this out any longer. The waiting, the pretending, it was killing me. Her face went pale, and she set the spoon down, turning off the stove as she did. She wiped her hands on a towel, more out of habit than necessity, and then folded her arms across her chest, as if bracing herself. "Okay," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice now. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. But there weren't any. Nothing could make this easier. So I just said it. "I know, Chloe. I know about everything." Her reaction was immediate. She blinked, her eyes widening, and I saw the flicker of panic there before she managed to compose herself. But it was too late, I'd seen it, and there was no hiding from it now. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly, but she was trying to play dumb, trying to keep control of the situation. "I saw the video," I said bluntly. "I saw what you did." The color drained from her face completely, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. She leaned back against the counter, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles turned white. "Joe, she started, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at me, eyes pleading, searching for some way to explain, to justify, but I wasn't in the mood to hear it. "I don't want excuses," I cut in, my voice low and tight. "I want the truth, Chloe. Just tell me why." Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to reach out for me, but I stepped back, putting distance between us. She flinched, as if my movement physically hurt her, and then she crumpled, sliding down to the floor, burying her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she sobbed. "I was stupid. So stupid." "Stupid doesn't even begin to cover it," I replied coldly, the anger I'd been holding back starting to seep into my voice. "You destroyed everything we had, Chloe." "For what? Why?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes desperate. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. I felt trapped, like I wasn't enough for you anymore. Like I needed to be more, to do more. And then Marcus, he offered me money, and I don't know, Joe. I lost my mind. I stared at her, barely able to comprehend what she was saying. It sounded insane, like some twisted rationalization for something that had no justification. You felt trapped? So you went and did that? I gestured vaguely, as if that could encompass all the horror of what I'd seen. And the money? What the hell was that about? She wiped at her tears, trying to steady herself, but she couldn't look me in the eye. He offered me $150,000, Joe. Just for 1 hour, one video. He said it would change everything for us, that we could finally do all the things we talked about, travel, buy a new house, start that business you wanted. I thought it would be worth it. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. This was about money? It didn't make any sense. We weren't struggling, we had a good life. I worked hard, but we were comfortable. How could she do something like this for money? You thought ruining our marriage was worth $150,000? I asked, my voice low and bitter. You thought selling yourself like that would fix anything? I wasn't thinking, she cried, her voice breaking. I was desperate, Joe. I didn't want to lose you, and I thought if I did this, maybe I could keep you. I know it doesn't make sense now, but at the time? At the time, what? I interrupted. At the time, you were so out of your mind that you thought fucking a bunch of strangers for cash was the solution to all our problems? Her face crumpled, and she started sobbing again, but I couldn't find any sympathy in me. All I felt was a cold, hard anger. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything, and she'd betrayed me in a way I never imagined possible. Joe, please, she begged, crawling toward me on her knees, her hands reaching out as if to touch me, to beg for forgiveness. I know I messed up. I know I did, but I love you. I love you more than anything, and I'll do anything to make it right. Please, just give me a chance. I stepped back again, shaking my head. You think this is something you can fix? You think there's a way to make this right? How, Chloe? How do you come back from something like this? Her sobs grew louder, more desperate, and she clutched at her chest as if the pain was too much to bear. I don't know, she whispered, brokenly. But I can't lose you. Please, Joe, don't leave me. Don't give up on us. But I was already gone. The woman in front of me wasn't the Chloe I had married. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize. And the life we had built together, the future we had planned, it was all shattered, broken beyond repair. I turned away from her, my heart heavy, but my decision made. I can't do this, Chloe. I can't stay here, not after what you've done. Her sobs echoed behind me as I walked to the door, her desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew if I looked back, I might waver, and I couldn't afford that. Not now. I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool night air. The weight of the decision settled on me like a physical thing, but I knew it was the only choice I could make. I couldn't stay with her. I couldn't forgive her. The betrayal was too deep, the pain too raw. As I walked to my car, I heard the door open behind me, and Chloe's voice, choked with tears, called out after me. Joe, please! Don't leave me! I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I didn't respond. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't know where I was going or what would come next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house, with those memories, with her. The woman I loved was gone, and in her place was someone I didn't know, someone who had destroyed everything we had. As I drove through the dark, empty streets, I felt the tears finally start to come. I tried to hold them back, but it was no use. They came in a flood, hot and bitter, blurring my vision as I drove. I didn't know how I was going to get through this, how I was going to rebuild my life from the ashes of what Chloe had done. But I knew one thing for certain, I would never be the same again. The days after I left Chloe were a blur. Time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways, with some moments dragging on endlessly and others slipping by in the blink of an eye. I spent most of my time at my mother's house, where I knew I'd be welcome without question. She didn't pry too much, though I could tell she was worried. She could see that I was carrying something heavy, something that was eating me alive from the inside out. It took me a few days before I could even bring myself to tell her what had happened. When I finally did, I could see the shock and sadness in her eyes, but she didn't judge or offer hollow platitudes. She just listened, holding my hand as I told her everything, even the parts one could barely say out loud. And when I was done, she just hugged me, like she used to when I was a kid and the world seemed too big and too scary. That was what I needed most, someone who wouldn't try to fix it, who wouldn't tell me how to feel or what to do next. I wasn't ready for advice or solutions. I just needed space to process the enormity of what had happened. The betrayal was like a deep wound, and I knew it would take time to heal, if it ever really did. For the first few days, I didn't even think about what came next. I didn't have the energy to plan or make decisions. I just went through the motions, eating when I had to, sleeping when I could, trying to distract myself with mindless TV or by helping my mom around the house. But nothing could really distract me from the thoughts that kept swirling in my mind, the images that replayed over and over again, even in my dreams. I avoided checking my phone for as long as I could. I knew there would be messages from Chloe, maybe even calls, and I wasn't ready to deal with any of it. But eventually, I couldn't avoid it any longer. When I finally powered it on, the notifications came flooding in, just as I'd expected. There were dozens of texts from Chloe, each one more desperate than the last. Apologies, pleas, explanations, it was all there. She begged me to come home, to give her another chance, to let her prove that she could make it right. She swore she would do anything to fix what she'd broken, that she would never make the same mistake again. I read through the messages slowly, my heart heavy with each word. I could feel her pain, her desperation, but it didn't change anything. It couldn't. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies or promises could undo what she had done. I knew that staying with her, trying to rebuild something out of the ruins, would only make things worse. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair, and without it, there was no foundation left to build on. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her how much she'd hurt me, to make her feel some of the pain that I was feeling. But another part of me knew that there was no point. No amount of anger or hurt could change the past, and it wouldn't make me feel any better in the long run. I had to be strong, not for her, but for myself. So I did the only thing I could think of. I blocked her number. The moment I did it, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't the kind of relief that comes from solving a problem or finding a way out, but more like the feeling you get when you stop banging your head against a wall. It was a small step, but it was the first one I'd taken toward moving on, and that had to count for something. The next step was harder. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever, but the thought of seeing her, of sitting down and actually going through with the divorce, made my stomach churn. But I also knew that I couldn't just leave things hanging in limbo. I needed to close this chapter of my life, to find some kind of closure, even if it hurt like hell. I made the call to a lawyer, one that my mother recommended. He was straightforward and professional, exactly what I needed. He didn't ask for details or try to dig into the messy emotions behind the situation. He just laid out the process, told me what I needed to do, and promised to handle everything else. I was grateful for that. I didn't want to relive it all over again in some lawyer's office. I just wanted it to be over. The hardest part was sitting down to sign the papers. I had thought about every word on those pages, every legal term that summed up the end of my marriage in cold, impersonal language. When I saw the word irreconcilable, it hit me like a punch in the gut. That's what it came down to in the end. We couldn't reconcile. We couldn't find a way back from what she had done. I signed my name on the dotted line, my hand steady even though my heart was anything but. It was final now. There was no turning back, no second chances. And strangely, that brought me some peace. It was like I had finally let go of something heavy that I'd been carrying for too long. Chloe didn't make the divorce easy, but she didn't fight it either. I think she knew, deep down, that there was no way to undo the damage. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. So did I. The day I got the final divorce decree in the mail, I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The official language, the signatures, the stamp of the court, it all felt so impersonal, so clinical. It was hard to believe that something as significant as the end of a marriage could be summed up in just a few pages. But it was done. We were done. And now, it was time for me to figure out what came next. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but each day brought a little more clarity, a little more distance from the pain. I threw myself into work, trying to focus on my startup idea, the one I had almost abandoned in the chaos of everything that had happened. It was something to keep me grounded, something to look forward to. My mom was a constant source of support, but I also found solace in old friends, people I hadn't seen in years but who reached out when they heard what had happened. They didn't pry or push me to talk about it, they just offered their company, their time, and that meant more to me than anything else. I moved into a small apartment across town, far enough from the house I had shared with Chloe that I wouldn't be reminded of her every time I stepped outside. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was a fresh start. There were nights when the loneliness would creep in, when the memories of what I had lost would surface, and I'd feel the sting of the betrayal all over again. But those moments became less frequent, less intense as time went on. I was learning to live with it, to accept that my life had changed, and that I had to change with it. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't let the past define me. Chloe's betrayal was a part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. I had a chance to write a new chapter, to find happiness again, even if it would take time. And as I sat in my new apartment, looking out at the city lights from my window, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to begin. A few months after the divorce was finalized, life started to feel like it was mine again. The rawness of everything Chloe had done had begun to fade, leaving behind scars that, while still tender, no longer bled with every touch. The apartment I'd moved into was slowly becoming a home, filled with the little things that made it mine, books I'd been meaning to read, pictures of places I wanted to visit, and the sounds of a life lived on my own terms. Work had become my refuge. I threw myself into my startup idea with a passion I hadn't felt in years. The factory job, though steady, had always felt like it was holding me back, a necessary grind to pay the bills. But now, with nothing tying me down, I saw the startup as my way out, a chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. I spent long hours at my desk, sketching out plans, making calls, and slowly bringing my vision to life. The project gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't tied to the past or to what I'd lost. It was about the future, about what I could create with my own hands and mind. And as I immersed myself in it, I found that the pain of Chloe's betrayal began to dull, replaced by the satisfaction of progress and the thrill of potential. But it wasn't all work. My mom, bless her, had made it her mission to get me out of the apartment and back into the world. She worried, I think, that I was isolating myself, using work as a shield against the hurt. And maybe she was right, but it was easier that way. Still, I knew she meant well, and she was persistent, so I started saying yes more often. We'd go out to dinner, just the two of us, and sometimes she'd invite friends along, old family friends, people I hadn't seen in years. At first, it was awkward, trying to navigate conversations that skirted around the elephant in the room, but over time, I found it became easier. The more I talked, the more I reconnected with people, the more I started to feel like myself again. There was one night, though, that stood out from the others. My mom had arranged a small gathering at her place, just a few close friends, some good food, and a lot of wine. I wasn't particularly excited about it, but I went along, figuring it would be better than another night alone in my apartment. That's where I met Emma. She was a friend of a friend, someone who'd known my mom for years but who I'd never crossed paths with. She was different from anyone I'd met before, soft-spoken, but with a quiet strength that drew me in. We ended up talking for most of the night, sitting off to the side while everyone else laughed and reminisced about old times. It was the first time in a long while that I'd felt genuinely comfortable around someone new. Emma had been through her own share of heartache, I learned. She'd been divorced for a few years now, after a marriage that had unraveled in ways that were all too familiar. There was no dramatic betrayal in her story, just a slow, painful drift apart that left her feeling lost and alone. We bonded over that, over the shared experience of picking up the pieces after everything fell apart. The conversation was easy, natural, like we'd known each other for longer than just a few hours. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people talking about life, about what came next. By the end of the night, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel so soon, a spark of hope. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we started meeting up. Sometimes we'd grab coffee, other times we'd go for a walk in the park, just talking about anything and everything. There was a comfort in being around her, a sense that I didn't have to pretend or hide anything. She knew where I was coming from, and I knew where she was. There were no games, no pretense, just honesty in a connection that felt real. It wasn't long before those casual meetups turned into something more. It wasn't like with Chloe, there were no grand gestures or whirlwind romance. It was slower, more cautious, but in a way that felt right for both of us. We were both wary, both carrying scars from our pasts, but we were willing to see where this new path might lead. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I invited Emma over to my apartment. I cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and some wine, and we ate on the couch, talking and laughing like we always did. But there was a shift that night, something unspoken that passed between us. After dinner, as we sat there, the conversation lulled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of the past bearing down on me. Instead, there was only the present, only her, sitting beside me, looking at me with those warm, understanding eyes. "I'm glad we met," she said quietly, her hand resting on mine. "I wasn't sure I was ready for this, but I'm glad." "Me too," I replied, meaning it more than I could say. And then, without thinking, without second-guessing myself, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft, tentative, but it felt right, like the beginning of something new, something that wasn't tainted by the past. When we pulled away, she smiled at me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could really move on. The relationship with Emma was different from what I'd had with Chloe. It wasn't built on the same youthful intensity or the same sense of certainty that had once defined my marriage. Instead, it was grounded in something more real, more enduring, a mutual respect, a shared understanding, and a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, we could find happiness again. There were still bad days, of course. Days when the memories would creep back in, when the hurt would resurface, and I'd find myself wondering how things might have been different if Chloe had made other choices. But those days were fewer now, and they didn't have the same power over me that they once did. With Emma, I felt like I was rediscovering parts of myself that I'd lost along the way. She encouraged me to pursue my dreams, to keep pushing forward with my startup, and to not let the past define who I was or who I could become. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when I'd retreat back into old patterns of doubt and regret, but she was patient, always there to remind me that it was okay to take things one day at a time. The startup started to gain traction, too. After months of hard work and late nights, I finally began to see some results. Investors were interested, the product was coming together, and for the first time, it felt like my dream might actually become a reality. It was a small victory, but it felt huge, a validation that I could build something out of the ashes of what had been. Emma was there for all of it, supporting me, cheering me on, but never pushing too hard. She understood that I needed to do this for myself, to prove that I could stand on my own 2 feet again. And as the business grew, so did my confidence, not just in my work, but in life. The future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. There was still a lot I didn't know, still a lot I was figuring out, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. The pain of Chloe's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. I was more than just what had happened to me. I was someone who had survived, who had rebuilt, who had found a way to keep going. One evening, as Emma and I sat together in my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I realized something that made my heart swell with a quiet joy. I was happy, not in the same way I'd been before, not in that naive, everything will be perfect way, but in a way that felt earned, hard won. I had been through hell, but I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more at peace with who I was. And as I looked at Emma, I knew that whatever the future held, I wasn't facing it alone. We were in this together, two people who had found each other at the right time, in the right way, ready to see where this new chapter would take us. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real, and it was enough. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. It was a crisp fall day, the kind where the air is just starting to bite, but the sun still shines warmly enough to make you forget that winter is on its way. I stood outside the house Chloe and I had once shared, the place that had been our home, where we had built our lives together. It was the first time I'd been back since that night I left, and seeing it again brought a flood of memories I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The house looked the same, but it felt different. The windows were closed, the blinds drawn, and the once vibrant garden Chloe had tended so lovingly was starting to wilt. It was like the house was reflecting the state of our relationship, something that had once been full of life but was now fading into something unrecognizable. I had come to say goodbye, to the house, to the memories, to the life we had built together. It was something I needed to do, a final step in moving on. Chloe had agreed to meet me there, to hand over the keys and close this chapter for good. We'd kept things civil during the divorce, but we hadn't seen each other since it was finalized. Today was the last tie we had left, and I was ready to cut it. She arrived a few minutes after I did, pulling up in the car we bought together when we first moved in. She stepped out, and for a moment, I was struck by how familiar she still looked. The same Chloe, the same woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, but also someone I barely recognized now. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and something that might have been hope, like she was wondering if there was still a chance to salvage something from the wreckage. "Joe," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, like she was afraid to break the fragile peace between us. "Chloe," I replied, nodding in acknowledgement. There wasn't much else to say. We both knew why we were here. She handed me the keys, her hand lingering a moment longer than necessary. "I'm really sorry, Joe," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a quiet acceptance that this was how it had to be. "I know," I said. "But it's too late for that now." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I wish things could have been different." "So do I admitted. "But we can't change the past." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said, all the things we couldn't go back and fix. But I didn't want to fix them anymore. I didn't want to go back. Chloe took a deep breath, steeling herself. "What will you do now?" "I'm moving on," I said simply. "I have to." She swallowed hard, nodding again. "I hope you find happiness, Joe." "I really do." "I hope you do too," I said, and I meant it. Whatever anger I'd felt, whatever bitterness had been there, it was gone now. There was no point in holding on to it. We exchanged a few more words, the kind of polite, meaningless conversation you have when there's nothing left to say. And then it was time to go. As I watched Chloe drive away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The chapter was closed, the final goodbye said. There was no going back now, and that was okay. I had Emma, I had my work, and I had a future that I was finally ready to embrace. I turned away from the house, slipping the keys into my pocket, and walked back to my car. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm glow over everything, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The past was behind me, where it belonged. And as I drove away, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it.